welcome everyone. Bienvenidos. So glad to see everyone here today. We're very excited, very excited for our keynote today. We'll begin starting in just a minute, but I would like to introduce our keynote and get this going so we can hear his wisdom and his gifts and all kinds of wonderfulness that I know we're about to be witness to. All right. So it's with my great honor to introduce Dr. Carlos Hipolito Delgado, who received his PhD in counselor education from the University of Maryland, College Park. He is an associate professor in counseling at the University of Colorado in Denver and has published various book chapters and scholarly journals articles. Specifically, research interests include ethnic identity development of Chicanos, Chicanx, Latinos, Latinx, and effects of internalized racism, training to improve the cultural competence of counselors in the psychopolitical development of youth. He has received several grants, research grants from the American Educational Research Association, the Spencer Foundation, and the Hewlett Foundation to study psychopolitical developments of students. He believes that education is empowering and a tool for increasing social justice in the world. His pedagogical approach is influenced by Paulo Freire and Bell. He hopes that his students leave his courses with a deeper sense of critical inquiry, informed view of what it means to be culturally literate, and a deep desire to become advocates for social justice. He serves on the governing board of the American Counseling Association and is a former trustee of the American Counseling Association Foundation and is past president of the Association for Multicultural Development. And I have seen Carlos in action as our current parliamentarian for the American Counseling Association this year, in which he brings business to the table. So with great honor, our keynote speaker today is the one and only Carlos Hipolito Delgado. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Let me get this screen share going and we can all kind of look at the same things here. But again, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much to Doctoras Gonzalez and Santos Dietz for the invitation to be with you all today. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here. As you heard a little bit about who I am, let me add just a couple of other things. I am the current interim executive director for our Latino Research and Policy Center at CU Denver, and I'm a professor of counseling in the School of Education and Human Development. When I'm not working, you'll usually find me hanging out with my family and my kids. My son is a very active athlete, and my favorite thing in the world is to sit and watch him play. So thank you very much. I want to kind of set a little bit of context and set where we're going with things today. And I think it's important to start with this one point. We are at a very volatile place in history. We are literally facing national instability. Our democratic structures are under attack. We are also struggling to emerge from a pandemic, right? There was those that would argue that we're on the other end of it. I'd argue we're still struggling to come out of it. Simultaneously, we have members of our community, miembros de nuestra comunidad, the Latinx community, the Latinx community, that are starting to realize the importance of mental health, particularly our young folks. Our young folks are engaging with conversations of mental health in a way I have not seen before in my life. But we are also facing a void. Those young people are facing a void in finding providers that can understand and speak to their experience, that can meet their needs. Thus, as mental health providers, we have a unique opportunity to fill that gap, to fill that void in the community, to create a lasting change in the way, in as a whole in the Latinx community, but particularly in how Latinx communities deal and discuss mental health. And so that's really the theme I want us to think about as we go into our conversation today. But before we really engage in some of those big points, I want to set some context for you. I want to set the context of where my comments are coming from today. The basis of my work and the basis of my conversation today is in the Latinx community in Denver and in Denver public schools. I am a part of a group of counselors, educators, research professors who promote youth voice within the district. We seek to support, within the Denver Public Schools District. What we do is we seek to support youth-adult partnerships in such a way that help youth voices be heard, in such a way that increases the access youth have to impact their schools and communities. And so what we do is we provide consultations. We talk with youth, we work with youth directly, we work with our adult partners, and we conduct research. And one of the areas in which we conduct research is around this notion of socio-political development. And I'll get into the definition of socio-political development as our conversation flows. With this said, in the work I do within the district, and in the work I do with educators and with families, I want to share a bit about what they're telling me. And so, yes, some of my conversation will be grounded in theory and research. Much of what I'll be talking about today is what I hear from our communities. And I'm sure, yes, there's distinctions between what's going on in Denver and what's going on in your context, but I'm sure much of it is the same or similar, right? And so I will share what these families, what these youth are talking about. And so where I have to start, unfortunately, is that our communities are hurting. Our communities are dealing with many compounding effects of things that are currently impacting them. And these things build upon each other and create a negative experience for the Latinx community, particularly as it relates to well-being and to mental health. We must start with the impact of the pandemic. The Latinx community faced exorbitant illness and death. Much like most other communities of color, we were hit particularly hard by the pandemic. I don't know about you and your experiences, but I know the process and trying to be safe for our families, right? Social distancing meant a lot of disconnection. And if your clients are anything like me and my family, much of our support system is built into familia, right? We support each other. We are our biggest strength and resource for each other. And so those natural support systems were deteriorated or lost entirely, right? People lost contact with friends. People lost contact with their family, religious organizations, sports, clubs, all of that was gone. You know, I saw it hit my daughter particularly hard. With school pushing online, with a lack of social outlets, she came to believe that she no longer needed people. She no longer needed friends in her life. She would spend the bulk of her days in her room on her laptop. And it's really only in the past year that I see her starting to reemerge. She has really struggled to break out of that mentality. And the sad part, particularly for the young folks, is we still haven't addressed that component of things, right? With my interns in specific, I train school counselors. What they tell me is they're seeing more mental health concerns stemming out of that pandemic this year than they saw in the previous two. And part of this makes sense, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to get those basic needs met. And it's not till later that some of these socio-emotional pieces can fully come forward. And in the return to school, what we're hearing and what we're seeing is a lot of discussion of learning loss and very little consideration of the socio-emotional needs of our students and our young people. Another spot where the pandemic hit folks really hard were changes in the labor market. Particularly our young folks in Denver were forced into the labor market for a number of reasons. One of which is they held jobs that were deemed essential. The other is they now were forced to help out family. Because they had these types of essential jobs, oftentimes they were the only income earners in their families. And so the push to go back to school left many of them disconnected. They had started earning, and it was tough for them to then re-engage with school. Racism is on the rise. I know we could talk about microaggressions. I know microaggressions are a legitimate concern. My bigger concern is outright racism. The murder of George Floyd created a racial awakening. It forced many folks in our community to deal with the impact of racial discrimination and particularly police violence. Now, the challenge with this is the rough emotions that this brought up for a number of folks and a lack of outlets for dealing with said emotions. You know, I did not look forward to having to have the talk with my children about discrimination and racism. If it was up to me, I would have loved to have waited a few years before we could have that conversation. But it was no longer a choice that I had. We had to discuss what was going on. Why were there people marching in the streets of Denver? And let me tell you, their fear and their sadness was crushing. It is really hard to explain to a fourth grader that some folks may not like them because of the color of his skin. Now, the Dark Lord, I don't refer to 45 by his name, much like Harry Potter lore. Yeah, we don't speak of the Dark Lord by his name. But the Dark Lord has emboldened racists to come out of the shadows. Look, I'm not of the illusion that racism is a thing of the past. Heck, we've seen it in my own family, and I'll explain that in a second. But what I wanted to share with you is a graphic was produced by the FBI. This is the number of hate crimes, and I believe this was from 2021, that occurred across the US. What we're seeing and what the FBI has called is there's an alarming rise in hate groups throughout the US. And again, my family is not immune to this. Just a couple of weeks ago, we dealt with this in a basketball game. As I mentioned, my son plays sports. Someone asked what sports he plays. He plays baseball and basketball. And a few weeks ago during the game, an opposing player called him an effing. I'm not going to include the word that was actually said. He plays on a mixed race team. They're pretty evenly split, Latinx and white. But that day they were playing with 5 players. A few folks were sick, couldn't come. My son played hard that game. he was battling with this kid that called him hateful names. And he held his own. And his team won. His team won by 15 points. But when he explained to me what happened, he broke into tears. It hurts. And as a father, you do your best to protect your children from instances like that. And having to explain, there's just going to be people that hate you because of the color of your skin, because you have a non-American last name. Of course, the league has taken no action against this other player, right? This despite that 3 of my son's teammates also came forward and acknowledged that they heard this player not only make racist remarks, but make homophobic remarks. The next thing I wanted to address, and I kind of alluded to this at the start, is there's a limited number of providers that are providing high quality, culturally relevant services. In my work with youth in Denver Public Schools, I support an Action Civics project where young folks investigate issues that impact their schools and their communities. They conduct original research, they propose policy solutions. Over the past 5 years, I've seen a sharp increase in the number of policies that are directly addressing issues of mental health or lack of responsive mental health. What I hear from these young people, what I see is they're pushing past stigmas that have impacted people of my generation and older. In particular, I'm sharing a policy narrative there for you there at the bottom of the screen. A particular group of young folks looked at the impact of gender norms around mental health. They wanted to study how Marianismo and machismo impacted helping and help seeking in their school. Working with them, what we found is that their school prioritized college counseling. And so they had a large number of college counselors and some social workers who were not adequately trained to deal with the mental health concerns that were going on in their students. So what these young folks did is they took matters into their own hands. They developed a program to educate their peers around mental health and to challenge the rigid biases and gender roles that exist within our community. Further, they pushed their school to hire mental health professionals. That last part remains a work in progress for them. The other thing that we must acknowledge, legislative attacks are hurting our communities. Specifically, we're dealing with a strong anti-LGBTQ environment, and the intersection between Latinx, Latina, and queer communities needs to be addressed. According to the ACLU, there are currently 496 anti-LGBTQ bills under consideration in the US. These bills would do everything from limit discussion around sexual orientation and gender identity, restrict healthcare for trans folks, weaken non-discrimination laws, limit free speech by way of banning books. I've heard our Latinx queer community tell me how these legislative attacks impact them. Even in a progressive state like Colorado, we deal with these same legislative attacks. What is worse is these things impact our young folks. Schools are outwardly hostile place for our queer students. According to a survey done by GLSEN in 2001, 68% of LGBTQ students reported frequently hearing homophobic remarks in schools. 32% missed an entire day in the last month because they feared for their safety. And nearly 60% said they experienced discriminatory policies within their schools. But latest legislative attacks have also gone after our mujeres. and after FEM identifying folks in the Latinx communities. These assaults have come from the Supreme Court and from legislative bodies. And what I hear folks telling me is sadness and disempowerment over not being able to make decisions for oneself and in regards to one's body. There's also a fear of backslide. You know, what's the next set of rights that will be lost? Relatedly, I met a group of young ladies at a charter school locally who, when requesting access to menstrual products in the school bathrooms, were told unequivocally no by school leadership, and no because they feared parental backlash. So these young ladies took matters into their own hands. They partnered with a local organization and applied for grants so they could purchase their own menstrual products and have those placed within their bathrooms. That's a picture of what they received and what they were able to purchase with these grants. What was awesome too is this organization also provided them with brochures and information around health and around contraception and birth control and things of that nature. These young ladies have since gained national and international attention. They've been invited to speak at Youth Voice and Youth Civic conferences. We must also address school safety. Too often, after an incident, a shooting, violence at school, the immediate reaction of adults is, how do we make things safer? But unfortunately, in talking about safety in schools, what ends up coming is what a student coined this phrase for me: theater safety. Theater safety are things like metal detectors, or, as you can see in that picture there, clear backpacks. Things that give the impression of making school safer, but don't actually do anything to make school safer. In talking about the clear backpacks, this particular student told me, he said, Carlos, if I wanted to carry a weapon, I could put it in my pants, or I could leave it in my car. Lost in this conversation is the feeling of youth. In Denver, we've been contending a bit with this notion around school safety, and it's something we've been forced to reckon with quite a bit. But we only engaged in this conversation after shootings at a predominantly white high school. When these shootings occurred in predominantly ethnic minority communities, there was no discussion of safety. And what the students came back and said, you know, when we deal with these theater safety, what ends up coming is it was business as usual the next day at their school. The shooting occurred, a student was shot in front of their school. It was talk about how are we going to make you safe. What the students said is they needed the moment to grieve and to process. And that wasn't actually happening. And then the students said they felt further traumatized when a series of active shooter drills took place at their school. Down in the far left is a picture of this same student group that I worked with. These particular groups of students noted that, particularly for students of color at their high school, more police did not equal feelings of safety. Rather, what they found through their research was schools that had more police officers gave more tickets to students of color. So the question they began asking is, whose safety was being prioritized, or whose feelings of safety was being prioritized? In the process of reintroducing police to schools in Denver, were the feelings of white parents and white students prioritized over students of color? Okay. In the previous 3 slides, I described how Latinx, Latina communities are hurting. But I'm wondering, did you hear anything else? And I see some folks taking advantage of the chat function. Please, let me know. Did you hear anything else in those stories? This is also a clever way for me to take a second to take a sip of water. Let me tell you what I also hear. What I hear are, oh yes, Casey, thank you. I'm hoping I'm saying that right, Casey. We're seeing self-advocacy, right? She mentions, or they mention, young folks getting involved in advocacy. I've seen resilience. I'm seeing student empowerment, right? Absolutely. What I'm seeing is people taking action to impact change. People taking action to address hurts, right? Advocating for themselves. Absolutely. We're seeing narratives being expressed, folks telling their and sharing their stories. So yes, our communities are hurting, but they are also taking action to address this hurt. There's a fundamental problem with how we are approaching counseling in my mind. And when we speak about mental health in the Latinx community, folks talk about needing more counselors. And yes, we absolutely need more counselors. But that in of itself doesn't get to the fundamental problems that we're facing within mental health. What I'm hearing from communities is even when services are present, it ignores their cultural reality and their lived experience. And the problem is there's a misalignment between dominant counseling theory and practice and the needs of our communities. And so I'm going to introduce just a couple of terms real quick. So bear with me if you've never heard these before, but I think it's helpful for our conversation. The first is that counseling takes an edict perspective. An edict perspective is a universalist perspective. It is the assumption that one approach or one theory is applicable across cultural reality, right? A single approach to mental health works for everybody. And most of our counseling theories are grounded in Western theory that do not necessarily respond to the lived experience of our Latina community. Most counseling is also autoplastic. Autoplastic assumes an internal etiology of the problem, saying that whatever mental health issue you are facing stems from your thoughts, your behaviors, and your feelings, right? Thus, autoplastic change requires you to adapt in those areas. What this does is it negates a system of domination. I argue that many of the issues we're facing within the Latinx community stem from external causes. As a matter of fact, I laid out a few of those external causes at the start of my talk today. In this context, what autoplastic change does is it forces the marginalized to adapt to a system of domination. Absolutely, it forces assimilation and disconnection. And finally, counseling is monistic in its approach. It's grounded in the idea that a singular form of change is sufficient. And that singular form of change is usually talk therapy, right? And while, yes, talk therapy can be excellent for helping to alleviate our concerns, what I would argue is you cannot talk yourself out of oppression. You cannot talk yourself out of marginalization. Fortunately, our young folks are thinking about mental health in a new way, particularly Latinx youth activists. They want an integrated approach to healing, to mental health. Yes, they are seeking to have their individual feelings addressed. Yes, they want to address their thoughts and behaviors. But they also want to change the systems that are contributing to these hurts and ills. This is a movement away from strictly focusing on the internal to looking at the larger systems that impact their thoughts and their feelings. And so what these young people are finding is that shared dialogue, that shared community helps to raise consciousness. It alleviates some of the victim blaming that we see. And it promotes emotional support. They're building community in new ways. But what they're also doing is challenging powerful systems. They're taking control of their narrative, right? And they're learning skills that are transferring into other settings. What these young people are doing is realizing their own socio-political development. They're coming to feel powerful. I saw somebody talk about empowerment earlier. We'll talk a little bit more about empowerment in a second. But yes, absolutely. Through claiming their narratives, they're feeling powerful. They are developing community. Yes, they're engaging in dialogue that addresses their feelings of sadness, loneliness, but they are challenging systems of oppression. Okay, well, what is this notion of socio-political development? This is probably, to me, this is kind of the go-to definition from Watts and his colleagues. But basically speaking, what socio-political development is, it's this process of gaining knowledge of self, understanding social inequity, understanding the systems that contribute to social inequity, and taking action to disrupt those systems. So it's about developing some consciousness, right? Redefining our relationships with marginalizing systems, and then taking steps to produce change. Watts argued that socio-political development should be centered in community psychology. And to be honest, community psychology and youth development are probably the spaces that are furthest ahead of us in this conception. What I would argue is socio-political development also needs to be centered in counseling. We could do a whole presentation on the history of socio-political development and all its theoretical constructs. But what I want to get you all to is thinking about how we do this with our clients. That being said, you do need a little bit of background. Anyone ever heard of Paulo Freire? I know Maria mentioned Freire in my introduction. Freire was a Brazilian educator. Specifically, he worked in literacy, teaching literacy to impoverished, illiterate farm workers in Brazil. In this work, what Freire realized is educational practices serve to create a subservient class. The way we approach education reinforces a power structure of haves and have-nots. Freire would eventually be exiled from Brazil for his teachings. I would argue that Freire is the greatest educational philosopher of the 20th century. If you've not had the opportunity to read any of his texts, I would greatly encourage you to. Just take your time with him, because he does absolutely write like a philosopher. Two big components that we take out of Freire's teaching is this notion of I'm going to kill myself in trying to say this. I can never say it right. Conscientization and praxis. And the gist of, we'll look at the first one in particular, conscientization is an awareness of how socio-political and cultural forces impact your life and taking action. Theories of socio-political development are also greatly influenced by liberation psychology. For those of you that have not spent much time with liberation psychology, allow me to tell you that it was popularized in South America and particularly moved from the one-on-one work, right, the talk therapy, towards understanding and creating consciousness around socio-political conditions that impacted one's lived reality. We must also acknowledge Watson Deemer. Watson Deemer did much to advance this work, where Freire talked about consciousness and consciousness development in a bit more abstract theoretical terms. What Watts did was begin to look at this as a stage model. What would this look like in progression? How would it flow? What's more is he documented that process, specifically in his work with Black youth in New York, where he kind of laid out what this could look like. What Deemer did was look at influences. And Deemer would argue that he's a psychometrician. I think Deemer's a lot of things, including that, but he advanced our understanding of the various sub-processes within socio-political development and the types of experiences that enhance socio-political development, and then also the life outcomes that are associated with socio-political development. What I'm here to tell you is socio-political development is not empowerment. Everybody wants to empower somebody, particularly in counseling, right? You see this all over the counseling literature. Heck, I even wanted to empower people back in the day. Yes, that's my first ever scholarly publication on empowerment in school counseling. The problem is that empowerment is very psychological. And when you look at empowerment in the literature as well, it tends to be individual, right? Focusing how you feel more powerful in your life. The challenge is that feeling powerful does not translate necessarily actually being powerful.
Yo tengo el presentimiento, es algo lo que yo siento, que todo.
Two things. One, I love charanga. Two, I hear that song, I hear that flute in that introduction. I am convinced I can play the flute. Absolutely convinced. It just sounds easy. Like it comes to me, I hear it, it seems to all make sense. I'm convinced of it. However, me thinking I can play the flute does not actually translate to me being able to play the flute. And thus the issue with empowerment. Yes, feeling powerful is a good thing. But feeling powerful doesn't equate to actually being powerful. And so what Watts and his colleagues and what Deemer have done is taken time to think about and to theorize and to explain and to document this process. How do folks come to actually be powerful? And this is probably the classic article around sociopolitical development, one of the first to really explain it out. But the gist of what we know about sociopolitical development is for it to occur, we must increase critical reflection skills, foster identity, increase sociopolitical efficacy, and lastly, engage in action. So critical reflection. This area is the one that's most written about, and partially that can be because there's so many related constructs in mental health, in education, and in youth development. So there's a lot of stuff out there if you're interested in fostering critical reflection. Now, what I'm here to tell you is it's more than just critical thinking, right? It's moving from deficit-based perspectives towards understanding politics and context. It's a movement for folks to understand history and structures. It's awareness of oppression. And this is a starting point. Consider the analogy to addiction, right? We need to understand there's a problem before we are motivated to fix this problem. And so part of that understanding of oppressive systems is realizing self in relation to oppression. Start with examination of where do I fit within systems of privilege and power? How does my race, my ethnicity, my gender, my sexual orientation, my socioeconomic background impact that? And there's a number of ways within counseling context with we can get towards these ends. I would argue that psychoeducational group settings is probably the best place to start with this critical reflection work. The consciousness raising group has been documented, particularly, again, back to community psychology, within community psychology. And there's some really interesting research, specifically with Latinx college undergrads around consciousness raising groups. If you are a follower of old multicultural counseling interventions, the Encounter group, also a great way for facilitating consciousness and awareness. Within feminist tradition, critical consciousness groups were also strongly used to raise awareness and inspire action against the patriarchy. The other spot we're seeing this too is within youth participatory action research, and particularly critical youth participatory action research, where young folks are engaging and understanding their school and their community context. I've addressed this a little bit, but knowledge of socio-political structures is important. And this was where we can learn from the work of Watts. And what Watts did with his young folks, he used hip hop. And he had young folks consider what he called the 5 critical questions. What do you see? What does it mean? Why do you think that? How do you think and feel about what you saw and heard? And what would you do to make it better? And he used those conversations and looking at, hip hop videos, looking at hip hop representations in the media to raise the conscience, particularly of African American boys. Now, probably my favorite intervention for critical reflection revolves around liberatory vision. And what this is a movement away from critique towards creativity. Part of critical reflection is the ability to envision a reality free of oppression and of oppressive structures. So critical reflection and ultimately socio-political development is more than usurping the oppressor. Any Marvel geeks in the room like me? And maybe you'll recognize this image from Black Panther. We've got T'Challa and Killmonger, right? Killmonger's vision of liberation was to arm marginalized and oppressed communities so they can usurp power and put themselves on top. This was a vision that T'Challa was actively opposed to. And so one of the tools we do in our work to promote this liberatory vision is something we call social dreaming. We can use art, experiential activities to get young folks in particular to think about a world free of oppression. This is analogous to the miracle question, right? And what these young people produce is often poetry, paintings, usually drawings. They don't have time to paint, but usually drawings, spoken word type performance to envision what liberation might look like. While that is a good starting point, one of the things that we also find is there's a need for a healthy self-definition. This is a reclaiming of identity, and a reclaiming of identity in a way that feels powerful to you. There's enough propaganda in the media that causes us to think about ourselves or pushes us to think about ourselves in certain terms. Instead, what we want is young people to understand, and all our clients actually to understand who they are and how they see themselves in authentic terms, in terms that are meaningful to them, right? So you're not saying, I'm Latinx because my 23andMe said I've got 70% Latino heritage. No, I'm Latinx because I relate to these things. These cultural realities speak to me. Now, there are a number of ways and a number of theories that can be used to enhance that identity, right? A number of counseling theories work here. But what is most important for us as mental health providers, as counselors, is to disrupt negative imagery and negative propaganda, to resist the definitions or the images that are given to us in the media. Instead, what we are trying to do is encourage self-exploration, encourage understanding, move towards an internalized locus of control where we define our identity in our own terms. Next, we want to increase efficacy. Sociopolitical efficacy basically is the belief that you can make a difference in the world. And people engage in action when they believe that they can impact the world. Individuals engage in action because they believe they can be successful. I want to take you back to the flute. As I mentioned, I'm convinced I can play the flute, right? Once upon a time, I was convinced I could play the drums. I heard the timings, I heard the patterns. I was absolutely convinced I could play the drums. Well, it turns out I actually could. A major difference there, though, I've studied Afro-Cuban percussion for a number of years. And sure enough, the success and the experience in learning about time and rhythm and learning to play Afro-Cuban percussion directly translated to the ability to take on this other task of playing the drums. Yes, that's a picture of me. Yes, I did once have long hair. And yes, I did have once a black beard. And whatever we were playing that day, I must have been really, really feeling, because I think my expression probably says that there. So this is a spot where, as counselors, we're not necessarily well-versed in, but it's a place where we can partner. It's a place where we can partner with community organizations. It's a place where we can partner with activist organizations. The goal is simple: helping our clients learn the skills that are necessary to engage in action and lead action, and getting the opportunities and experience as leaders. There's nothing magical. One of the things that have come out of our research is simple things like, I was in charge of my group today, or I was expected to speak on behalf of my group. Built that sense of efficacy. Now, lastly, you must engage in action. Action is necessary to change oppressive systems. Liberation is not gained by chance. It requires commitment to rectify unjust systems. This can be a range of things, though. We can start slowly. We don't have to take over the world all at once. Watts described practicing critical thinking skills and encouraging critical thinking skills in other folks as a form of action. And this is where efficacy is also important. The more you engage in action, the stronger you feel about your ability to impact change. Now, as we're getting close to the end of our time together, I want to reinforce where we started. We're at a tenuous point in time, both nationally and within our communities. Our communities are absolutely hurting. The impact of marginalization and oppression weighs heavily on them. But our youth in particular stand ready. They've learned the language of mental health. They are drawn towards and want to engage in activities that promote wellness. And they are ready to use their voice and advocate for social change. What they need are adult partners. They need folks who are qualified in helping them process their hurt. But they also need folks that will help them impact social change. What I want to ask of you all is, will you be their allies? Will you be their accomplices? Will you help them in impacting social change? We possess the skills, the knowledge, the resources to help our young folks and to help our communities deal with these hurts. We possess the trainings and the skills to be advocates. The time is now. What I'm asking you to do is be that ally and accomplice in social change. Help impact the socio-political development of our communities. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for your time. I think I've got a minute or two if there's a question, but I will also yield to our organizers if we need to get going.
Thank you so much, I want to, like you said, open this up to any questions or thoughts folks may have. We have a few minutes left, so I wasn't sure if anyone had any questions. Or you can add the questions in the chat as well. You have a bunch of thank yous.
A lot of thank yous for all of us. That was so powerful.
Yes,
Very,
yes.
very impactful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hipolito. And I just keep thinking about that word empowerment. I think even from the very first time that I heard that term used here in this country, it really caused a reaction, physical reaction in me. It was like, there is something wrong there. And it was hard to pinpoint, but I knew there was something wrong there. So thank you for validating my reaction to it. Especially when I receive it from a person with power and in power. It was like, oh, that's easy for you to say when I am, new in this country with kind of issues with the language, with no family, with no resources, not knowing the system. Like, oh, and I need to empower myself. Interesting.
And what usually worries me about it is we talk about empowering people. Power can't be given. Power needs to be claimed. Because when power is given, power can be taken away, right? As such, I think that's why socio-political development speaks to me, because it entails us claiming power. And then again, moving beyond just feeling powerful to being actually powerful. Absolutely, we've got strengths and we've got to build off of that position of strength, right? We are powerful beings. And the more we seek to claim that and claim our narratives and impact our communities, that sense of power just increases within us.
And we are more powerful together.
Eso también. Eso también. We do not do a good enough job in our community of working together and coming together. If that's a critique I can levy, I know it's definitely true in Denver. The Latinx community is so splintered, and we splinter over, really silly things. We need to come together to work together to impact change. I don't tell them to look towards a specific role model. I want them to be powerful on their own terms. Individual people are imperfect, right? However, if you embrace your identity, if you embrace your culture, there's strength there. So it's not that I tell them not to look towards people, but I want them to look towards themselves and see themselves as being powerful.
And thank you also for making that connection between our profession and this like political development, and how, to kind of start thinking and open our minds of how to do this in a different way. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No. At one point, I toyed with calling this presentation "When Talk Isn't Enough." But I don't want to play down talk. Talk is important. Talk therapy is absolutely important. But what I'm saying we need to move away is from talk therapy alone towards engaging with changing systems. And again, I think we've got the example from our young folks. Our young folks are ready to take that step.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Let me just check any other questions or comments, final comments.
Your work has been used in dissertations. I've used your work as well in classes and work. So thank you so much for all your advocacy with your research and putting out the conversations out there where many people can be exposed to these truths.
Well, thank you all for inviting me here. This is honestly a big deal for me to get this kind of an invitation. Again, I still think of myself as the kid from East LA. So anytime I get invited to something like this, it's an absolute honor.
Oh, well, thank you. It's ours as well. And so great to be in community with you. Thank you so much for being with us today, spending this last hour and sharing your gifts. And we're all truly appreciated to have you here. Thank you so, so much.